that?
As of now, it is, yes. Yes, I guess also we could begin. Maybe we should wait a few more minutes just to see if more people are going to show up.
I think if people are muted when they arrive, then it doesn't make a lot of difference.
Okay, well, with that, I wanted to give a few instructions. I'm going to ask if the guests in this strange assembly would please turn off their microphones and their cameras as to avoid some of the distractions that can happen in this technological meeting place. Yeah. I'm also, once we have a good sense of things, I'm going to lock the meeting so that we don't have any Zoom bombers or anything of that sort, although I do think that would be kind of fun. Perhaps not for an event though. I can't imagine that would be fun for the candidate. And with that, I guess I'll begin. I'd like to thank and welcome everyone to this oral examination of Mir, I just learned how to pronounce it properly. Mahdavi.
Yes.
Mahdavi, sorry, yeah. Mahdavi. And for Mir Mahdavi's doctoral dissertation, Speaking of Being, Poetry as the Psychoanalysis of Presence, from Language to Lalanguge. With that, I'd like to introduce all of the examiners, the committee, as well as the candidate. So I'm going to start with the external examiner. Can't stop it now. Now that it started, it's just going to continue. Examiner, Ross Leckie, who is a professor in English in the department, or a professor in the English department at the University of New Brunswick. Yes, I'd also like to thank and welcome the internal external examiner, Ihor Junik, who is a professor in cultural studies, English, and creative writing at Trent. And the committee member, Dr. Dwayne Roussel, who's a professor of sociology at Nipissing University. Committee member, Dr. Jeffrey Donaldson, professor of English at McMaster. And of course, the supervisor, Mir's supervisor, Dr. Hugh Hodges, who's a professor of English and cultural studies as well at Trent University. Finally, of course, I'd like to welcome and introduce Mir Mahdavi, who's a PhD candidate in cultural studies, of course, ready to defend his dissertation. I'd also like to congratulate him on all of his work. So with that, I am going to move all of the guests and Mir into the breakout room, and we're going to start by a little discussion of the committee about the protocol and the order.
I'm moving them all.
Okay, thank you. Catherine will do it all.
Let's see. Who got missed?
Did was Mir's the fact that his microphone and video were off, is that a requirement, or he was preferring it that way? I didn't know whether to say, you know, Mir, where are you, or not.
As far as I know, it's not a requirement. I think that was just a choice, possibly nerves, possibly other aspects for this. I believe Ross had a question about protocol. So normally here we go through rounds of questions. Everyone is able to ask 3 questions in the first round. We begin with the furthest away from the candidate. So we begin with the external, then go the internal external, then the third member, the second member, and the supervisor. And we will do that in rounds. So yes, we invite each member of the examination committee to ask 3 questions, beginning with the external, ending with the supervisor. We invite each member of the examining committee to ask additional questions after that, beginning with the external and running through to the supervisor. Then we ask if members of the examining committee have any further questions. If time permits, we then open the question floor up to the audience. Then we return the student and the audience to a breakout room where we will discuss, and then we come up with whatever recommendations we make. So the meeting itself will begin with Mir giving a 10 to 15 minute presentation about his work, and then we'll go into the questions.
Good.
Is that
That's good with me.
Understood.
so much joy? So much joy in these Zoom meetings.
Well, it's not usually any livelier in a live defense. Who asks for questions for who goes next? Okay, it's your turn. It can get livelier later.
Yes, hopefully.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so I guess with that, we can have everyone else return.
Yep.
They have 60 seconds to return to the room.
This is where we do dances that they don't know about. And then we look very professional.
They bring themselves back. Is that how it works? It's a very interesting.
They
mechanism.
have 60 seconds before the room automatically closes and pushes them all back into this room.
I see. I see. Yeah. I must learn how that works. That's a very handy little mechanism. I could see using that in the smaller discussion groups in a class. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's everyone.
Okay, so now that everyone's back, I just want to remind the audience, if you could please turn off your mics and your video so that we can have as little distraction as possible for Mir as he goes through the process of defending his dissertation. And with that, I would like to invite Mir to begin this event with a brief presentation on his dissertation. Yes, so about 10 to 15 minutes if possible.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Hi, Mir.
Hi. Okay. I would like to give you a map of my journey instead of giving you a summary of what I have done. A map of my thought evolution, you could say. And then I would like to share with you what I am going to do after I'm done with my PhD, if I am done with it. So basically, how got into this point and where I'm going from here, that's what I'm going to share with you in about 10 to 15 minutes. I like to emphasize that my research and my dissertation is founded on a single question. And the question is, what is poetry? I didn't even try to find any response or any answer for this question. Instead, I attempted to expand and explain the question itself to see what does it mean when we ask, what is poetry? Rather, I took an instance, examples of to see how poetry functions. So as a poet, basically, I had faced and I have dealt with this question of what is poetry, how it functions, what it's made of, and all these questions. And basically, these questions for a poet is not just a philosophical contemplation or philosophical concern. Rather, it is a work-related question. It is a working question for a poet to see what is the thing that they're making, they're producing. And that was a very, long concern of myself, that what is this that I'm producing? I realized through my research that the question of poetry is itself poetic. It is as ambiguous and as unintelligible as the poetry itself. So I did my MA at McMaster University. I had the pleasure to be supervised by Professor Jeffrey Donaldson, and I did my thesis on the area of poetry, the question of whether poetry translation is possible or not. So with practically working with poetry, with practically being engaged with poetry when I started my PhD at Trent University, I had several classes, several courses that were very directional, influential, and transformative. And I'm going to name a number of those classes in order to give you a map of my journey. The first short essay that I had, called Man Develops Poetically by Martin Heidegger. And this was something that I was thinking before reaching to Heidegger. I was thinking that we live, we act, we think poetically as human. This caused me to go further and read more of Heidegger. The second book that I read was On the Way to Language. And I found completely groundbreaking definition of language and word. For Heidegger, a word is the absence of what is attempting to signify, the empty place of its signification. And this was absolutely poetic. And when it comes to language, he doesn't see language as a medium of thought. He doesn't see as a container to contain thoughts and ideas. Instead, he thinks language as a relation of all relation, as not a saying, but as nearness of saying. And language is made by finitude, in his view. And language is letting something be seen, and finally as the presence of presence, not the presence itself, but the presencing of presence, as nearness of saying. So with this, when he comes to poetry, it comes exactly the area that I love to hear and love to listen and love to be engaged. And in a sense, I was into it without knowing it. He defines poetry in relation to truth, basically. And he sees poetry as projective saying, and as word making, founding, naming, unconcealment of truth, dwelling, saying of being, the extension of being. And perhaps the later Heidegger defines poetry as the power of estrangement and as the letting go of language. So it was absolutely very transformative experience dealing with Heidegger. And I read works related to Heidegger. I'd like to mention two of those groundbreaking Heideggerian's work. One by William S. Allen called Ellipsis, and the second one was Gerald Brown's Heidegger's Estrangement. And I lived with those two very, very crucial works. The second class I had was the dream interpretation of Freud, and I was reading, I remember in the class of Dr. Jonathan Bordeaux, that I have the pleasure that he's here today as well. I thank him. So in one of the pages, Freud says, generally speaking, words are often in dream treated as things, as objects, and this was exactly what I was doing in my producing poetry, in my poetic work, treating words not as words, but as objects. So this was very interesting for me. I said, okay, I'm going to take on Freud as well. I'm going to read it, I'm going to enjoy it, and as much more I got involved in Freud, as much more I enjoyed. Freud defined dream as the disguised fulfillment of suppressed wishes. And he basically identifies 4 important qualifications of dreams. 1, dreams are not intelligible, poetry. 2nd, they fall into pieces as soon as they come into being. 3rd, they're scattered, mobile. You can find them fixated in one place of the psyche. And 4th, they're not fully interpretable. And he continued this idea of not being interpretable of dream in his theory or talk on dream navel. And he says in every dream, there's a spot that you cannot find its meaning. You cannot bring that into language. And then finally, the way Freud explains the works of dream, or how dream works, or dream work, he says it's based on 2 forces of condensation and displacement. And as we know, Jakobson and later Lacan related that these 2 are basically 2 literary forces, 2 literary truths, metaphor and metonymy. And that was a connection to poetry again. And I was thinking either poetry is dream, or dream is a poetry, or it's so well connected to each other. The 3rd work that was very important to me was Ronald Barthes' Camera Lucida. This introduced to me photography, photograph, and from photography I went to imaging, imagination, and metaphor. And this was well connected to Freud and Heidegger in my view. So basically, in photography, what we see is not the photo itself, but what it contains. And then this relation of the presence of absence, to be filled with the absence of something, to show the absence of something, or to bring to presence the absence of something. And the idea of the relation of death and photography was really important to me and very crucial. So as we all know, Tchaikovsky and Blanchard think that poetry speaks in image. Poetry think in image. So the relationship between image and poetry, and perhaps image and imagination, was well connected to each other. So I went to study more in poetic imagination, and I found that poetic image is the sum of the presence of an absence. The 4th incident was that I took a metaphor course at McMaster University. Dr. Jeffrey Donaldson was teaching this course, and I asked him if I could please join to this course, and he was generous enough to let me in. So I did a full course of metaphor outside of my study, and it was well connected to what I was doing. So I was introduced to Notre Fry, Paul Lecour, and so many more. And so the idea of metaphor, that Rossetti is going to question me on metaphor, I'm scared of him, what kind of question he has on metaphor, but metaphor is the idea of this is that. And at the same time, we know that this is not that. And this was so poetic. And this was so well connected to the things that I was doing. And when later on, I found that recourse as metaphor is thinking more. It's opportunity of thinking more. Every metaphor is the place that it offers you the possibility to think more. And in the area of metaphor, on metaphorical thinking, beside works of Professor Donaldson, I really liked also Lakoff Johnson's So the way the way Jacob Johnson's metaphor, what was it? Metaphor we live by. Yeah, I got it. Okay, so the conceptual metaphor. So it was very interesting and very directional to me. So basically, I got to the last stage. In one of my classes, I had a short introduction to Jacques Lacan. And I had a class with Professor Rousseau. Dwayne came to that class and taught us about Lacan, and I really enjoyed that class. I still remember that. Thank you, Dwayne. And from there, so Lacan introduces the unconscious as language. He basically relate unconscious to language. And this was something very interesting in the beginning for me, that to see how our psyche, our unconscious, the biggest part of our psyche is related or is linguistic in a sense. So Lacan says the unconscious is the language of the other. And then when he talks about the work of signifier or his semiology, he thinks that he says there is no such a thing as signifier. All we have is a chain of signifiers. We go from one signifier to the other signifier. There is an interruption. There is a gap between unremovable gap between signifier and signifier. So when I started reading from Freud and I read Fink's work on Freud was amazing. The subjectivity on Freud. Lacan, I corrected. And so I continued reading Lacan with sort of anxious and with interest to see how I can, understand all this paradoxical contemplation on language, and later on poetry and so on. In the later Lacan, I found a better place to reside in terms of a poet and in terms of poetry. We all familiar with his sort of descriptive relation of subject to the world as imagination, the real, the symbolic, the imagination. And so he not directly the real to the symbolic, instead of having the formal and historical knot of symbolic to imagination, to have the image of something and related to language. He relate directly the real to the symbolic. And this is exactly what happens in poetry. And he later emphasized that poetry is a symptom. It is where the real is knotted directly to the symbolic. So this was a very sort of directive area, and I really enjoyed reading Lacan, and I really enjoyed receiving so much help from Dwayne, and I will continue reading it. So coming all this through and starting writing my dissertation, I had Dr. Hugh Hodge on my side, accessible, and he was ready to help me as many times as I needed, as soon as it was needed. And many questions that I referred to him, and the answer was right there. And he offered me his library, and I enjoyed reading and taking his book out and using it. Thank you, Hugh. So this was a very brief mapping of my journey. Now I'd like to share with you to tell you where I'm going from here. So 3 big ideas are in my mind. Number 1, the relationship between the poetic real and the unreal. Sorry, the poetic real and the real. To sort of discuss and research and find out how the real is connected to the poetic world and to the poetic work. Perhaps Maurice Blanchard thinks that image deforms poetry, and this deformation creates the possibility of the poetic unreal to look real. And this is exactly what I'm very interested to see under what circumstances the poetic real look real. The poetic unreal look real. I'm very interested in Blanchard's work, and perhaps I would like to continue this journey, if I would, to see how these two different worlds are related under the supervision and eyes of Blanchard. The second area that I'm very interested is Freud's formation of the real. He says that the boundary between the real, the boundary between the real experience in dream and the fiction of narration of it. So we have the real experience of dreamer and his narration of what he has experienced. I know it is not the real, but it is what the experience of the real that a dreamer has. And I may extend this to the experience of reading poem, experiencing in reading poetry's unreal world and how we can relate that to the real. The third area that I'm interested is the sort of a direct assessing of the relationship between real and poetry in relation to Jacques Lacan's work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mir. That was an interesting presentation on where your work has come from and where your work is going. With that, I would like to invite the committee to ask some questions about the dissertation. We're going to begin this round of questions with the external, and then we're going to come through each committee member until we end with the supervisor. Each committee member and the external is welcome to ask up to 3 questions in this section. So if we could please begin with Professor Leckie.
Hello, Mir, thank you so much for a very fine dissertation that I enjoyed reading. I found it thought-provoking on almost every page, and I really admired the scope of it. I admired how you could move from Heidegger to Freud to Lacan and find interwoven connections between those figures, not to mention others. And it also seemed like a very Heidegger-like beginning to say, what is poetry? And then say, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to ask, what does it mean to ask that question? So what I'd like to do is sort of start with quite a large question about metaphor, and an answer to this question is perfectly fine if you say, I haven't really had much time to think about that, and I'll get back to you later. Later being sometime a year from now or whenever you'd like. Okay, so I realize that this might be a bit reductive, but it seems like there's a tradition of understanding metaphor in a binary form, usually framed in something like A is B, or A equals B, or X equals Y. Something of that sort. And we can think about Richard's idea of vehicle and tenor, or Black's idea of focus and frame, or Ricoeur's idea of the replacement of A as to B, or Zwicky's A as Y, Lakoff and Johnson's source domain to target domain, and so on. Now, I realize that that's really simplifying many of those theories, but one of the things that I find unsatisfying about those theories is that, something like A equals B, let's take that for an example. Oh, that in turn is a metaphor taken from mathematics, and it's kind of metaphor for metaphoricity, as it were. And it really seems like so often when we take your example, John, as a lion, that can be bravery, it could be power, it could be strength. If I, and in the big bang of the metaphor, I'm still, it's reverberating into things like Richard the Lionhearted and the Cowardly Lion and the lions outside New York Public Library, known as Patience and Fortitude. And so John becomes Richard, and et cetera, et cetera. And so it seemed to me that it'd be more accurate to metaphor to say many A's equal many B's. That you can't really find a formulation in that mathematical, or part of the seduction of that idea of the mathematical metaphor is to take one metaphor of metaphoricity and think of it as the metaphor of metaphoricity. Okay, so here's my question I'm going to finally get to. I'm wondering if what I'm saying resonates for you in relation to Heidegger and the idea of presencing, not bringing the present forward, but being the kind of possibility of the present, which implies the absence and provides the possibility of an emergence of being, of the uppercase being. Like so many of the ideas that Heidegger presented seem to be suggesting, or as he presented Heidegger, certainly seemed to be suggesting or calling for a more complicated thinking about metaphor. And so I was wondering what you think about that, and maybe I'll ask follow-up questions to your speculations.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Lucky. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Yes, Lucky, that's correct.
Okay, Lucky. Thank you. Yeah, so yeah, it is reduction when we say A is equal to B or A is B. And in a sense, when we make, especially in literary works, in poetry, we are ought to have that reduction. Because when I say John is a lion, I need to sort of extend John out of his existence and bring him out of his environment and make him something else, and at the same time keeping him as John. So this reduction could be, if I'm not a literary professional to to be able to explain how this exactly and philosophically can be explained. But in practice, in poetry, and as far as my research allows, the poet and the literary work who does it can bring this reduction to a kind of expansion. So it's not just a reduction. We reduce it to make it bigger, to expand it. Yes, if we look to this issue in terms of just philosophy of language and literary, could be seen only as reduction. But when we deal with literary works, when we read a poem, this reduction could mean expansion, could mean the expansion of that idea that we once reduced it and it's not reduced anymore. And I think this is where Heidegger works, and he in a sense, I assume that acknowledges that metaphor could not be A as equal B. That's how I understand it. It's not the equation or mathematical explanation, but rather when language expands itself and moves away from itself, it creates the possibility to do more with what it has in hand, to make the reduced entity to be expanded.
Yeah, I like what you're saying. As a, I know you're a poet, and I'm a poet, and so we're often dealing with the practicalities of these issues. And it often strikes me that in thinking about metaphors, I'm often thinking about or aware of, let's say, the notion that as I'm making the metaphor, the terms of that metaphor in some senses don't exist, or they're not present, I guess, to use that language. They're only present as possibilities, and that the reverberations of those metaphors are going to take us into expansion, even as I'm trying to pin it down with specific words. And in some senses, for metaphors, often the more specific, the better. So I wanted to ask you then about, I was thinking about you quote Mark Strand's Keeping Things as a Whole. And it struck me that that poem begins with asking about these very problems, and you're using the poem as an example to explore these in a variety of contexts. And the poem begins, in a field, I am the absence of field. And so this is kind of a large question, and that calls for speculation in your part, in part as a writer. I'm wondering if many poems, or perhaps all poems, that's too grand a claim, but many poems aren't already telling you about the metaphors the poem will use to explain metaphoricity. In other words, they're already establishing a notion of how the poem is thinking about what it is to make a metaphor, even as it's making its metaphors. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, yes, absolutely, yeah. So, yeah.
Did you want to say more about the Strand poem?
Let me, if I could bring the poem, just give me one.
Sure.
Second, please. Sorry.
While you're doing that, I'll just say one of the things I really admired in your thesis were your close readings, which I found really extensive, and you know, that you provided excellent examples for many of the ideas that you were presenting.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay. Oh my God. Okay, I'm almost there. Sorry.
You know, we don't need to look at the poem. Maybe I could just. Have you got it?
No, I didn't get it. So yeah, I can make.
Maybe I can just ask this question in this way. I think we sometimes just refer to things as extended metaphors, right? So here's a poem, and it's going to have an extended metaphor that runs through it, and that word extended just seems to gloss over a number of interesting questions, because extended to me suggests putting the metaphor through a variety, through a number of variations, let's say. And Strand's poem, I think, does that exactly. As it moves, it keeps presenting this idea of field and moving through the field as a whole series of kind of languages relation, as the relation of relations, I think is the way Heidegger puts it. And so I guess this will be just my last question for now is, do you see a complexity in reading metaphor in relation? I don't know why I'm focusing on Heidegger in particular, because this could go to Freud as well, I think, but for whatever reason, Heidegger is more present in my mind, or is more presencing in my mind, however you want to put it. Is there kind of an allowance for an unfolding of metaphor? Let me put it in any of the thinkers. Like, do you see a process of that idea of an extended metaphor going through its variations or its unfoldings as a way of relating to the theories of Heidegger, Freud, or Lacan?
Well, absolutely. I mean, one of the sort of relation and one of the connections that the scholars that I mentioned, their names, is the way they look at metaphor as the the extension of something. And you mentioned Strand's poem where field is how the metaphorical itself presence of being a field and not being a field.
Yeah.
And but at the same time, the way this word is related to the next word, or to the wording of the poem as whole, present the possibility of opening up more windows and more things that is attached to this. So as an extended metaphor, each metaphor, I think, generally speaking, about strength. I love Strand's work, and I started reading with Dr. Jeffrey Donaldson's metaphor class, and since then I'm reading it almost every day, and I learn. So I can say that each and every metaphor in Strand's work can be seen in a sort of an extended metaphor, can offer you more metaphorical perception. Not only that, but also offers you more metaphor in terms of to give you layers of complexity to defer meaning, and instead gives you in the Lacanian language to give you more response.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
And with that, I'd like to ask Ihor Junik to please begin with his questions.
Thank you. I'm blinded by this light coming through my window. Mir, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. Has a special poignancy for me. I was just thinking about the fact that we really met extensively for the first time when you worked as a seminar leader for my world literature class. And here we are speaking about your own literary criticism and your own work in the field. So, I mean, there's a nice connection and circularity and closure as far as I'm concerned. So, like I say, it's a pleasure. So I'm going to switch gears rather dramatically, actually, for my question. And I want to sort of focus in on something and ask you about something that strikes me as an oversight, perhaps, an elision, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, I'll be interested to hear sort of what you say about it. And that's the issue of politics. And I think that there are several ways we could and perhaps should sort of approach this. But I mean, the most pressing, I think, is vis-a-vis the figure of Heidegger, who, we've already noted is sort of one of the key go-to figures in the dissertation. I mean, the really sort of the key theorist that you refer back to over and over again. And what we don't get any of is a connection of Heidegger's politics, his involvement with Nazism, and the connections between Nazism and his philosophy and his aesthetics. And for a long time, I mean, that was sort of bracketed, right? I mean, the interpretations often went that Heidegger is one of the greatest philosophers, perhaps the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. And I mean, there are these missteps, but I mean, this was political naivete, or, this was over here and this is over there. So, I mean, we can keep these easily separated. But I mean, there's been, and I'm by no means an authority on this work, but I mean, it's crossed my path, numerous times. I mean, I'm aware of some of it. The work of the last several decades, I would say, has really been focused on the ways in which Heidegger's philosophy and his aesthetics is perhaps deeply implicated in his Nazism. The ways in which his philosophy is kind of shot through with his political practice and activism in the 30s. So I guess, and we can say more about that. I mean, one of the I think sort of crucial issues that some have picked up is the way in which it really is the issue of poetry and language really sort of leaps to the fore in this respect. That in Heidegger's work, I mean, he does have some conception of the sort of the world historical role of Germany in moving the world out of a kind of technological instrumentalism, and sort of the instrument by which, or the power by which that's going to happen, is the German language, right? Which has a unique status and privilege because of its connection all the way back to the Greeks. So there's a way in which his focus on poetry, I think, perhaps forces us to ask certain questions about sort of the political implications of his philosophy and the role of poetry in his philosophy. So with that whole preamble and spiel, I guess, my questions to you are, was it a conscious effort not to speak about politics? Why did you opt not to speak about this? Given a figure like Heidegger and the sort of the controversies that have hounded him, like I say now, for several decades, can we speak about this material without engaging with the politics? Anything on that terrain would be welcome. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
Thank you, and I'm so glad to see you here after a long time. So this question, it was in my mind to see his political background and his political approach. But I was so agree. I couldn't agree more with Ronald Barthes' The Death of Author, and I did not approach to Heidegger as in a sense of authorial as the author of his thoughts, but I was dealing with Heidegger speaking of poetry, not getting engaged with politics in the moment that he was talking to me. And he was only a philosopher of language and a philosopher who speaks about poetry, language, thought. And I was very curious about how he can use and manipulate his readers to present his political identity and political idea. But I could not find any connection, any relation of his Nazism and his political background to what he was talking about poetry. So I was sure that what I was reading, it was a sort of, I could say something not politically motivated of talking about poetry. And for this reason, I didn't need to mention his political background. For me, Heidegger in my work, in this work, is a philosopher who talks about poetry, about language, about words. That's all. So I keep the other Heidegger outside of my work if I could.
Okay. I mean, is not all poetry perhaps political? I mean, particularly your take on poetry, which is as a kind of revealing of the inner essence of being. Might we not say that is always a political act?
We could say, and we could say more if we deal with examples of poetry, with poems, and we could have our political take of that poem, absolutely. But when he talks about revealing and concealing of being, or the extension of being, I don't hear a very loud voice of politics behind his words talking about the function of word itself, or the how word outside of politics function. This politics could be the politics of poetry or the politics of any other involvement, but outside of any politics, word as word functions in a way, and he tries to give me that, or I receive the assurance that he only talks about the word itself and how it functions, and the poetry as it functions and relates to the being.
Great. I'm going to keep pressing the political, but maybe we can switch gears within this topic a little bit and speak not of Heidegger, but actually of surrealism, which is another sort of key reference point for you. And once again, I'm sort of interested in sort of potentially the sort of the political dimensions of this. And as I was reading your dissertation, I was reminded of a line by Octavio Paz, actually the Mexican poet and surrealist. And I'll just read it here. It means Paz says at one point, surrealism proposes not so much the making of poems as the transformation of men into living poems. So, you know, once again, and sort of I thought once again of sort of Breton, the early days of surrealism, and sort of the political dimensions of that movement, you know, the attempts by Breton to connect surrealism to communism, and sort of the vision of surrealism as a kind of artistic force that's able to transform the world to make it a more living human kind of world. So, I mean, I don't know, any thoughts about sort of the political dimension of that side of things?
Well, I mean, the quote that you brought from Pause, it reminds me a sense of Heidegger talking about poetry as an unfinished project. Like the living poem could be read as an unfinished project, or the dwelling poetically, again Heideggerian. And I take it from this side, rather taking from the political engagement of this statement, sort of contemplating on a specific ideological area, or being used as a device containing political identity. Well, for some reason, I don't see that, or I don't see it very strongly. What I see it as poetry offer the possibility of living, not just what Heidegger calls the poetry is the extension of being, but also a uninterrupted, ongoing process of poeticizing.
Okay, thank you. I'm happy with this round for me. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, moving forward, I would ask Professor Roussel to begin his questions.
Thank you, Mir. That was quite impressive. Also, your dissertation obviously opens up a lot of questions for me. I feel the need to begin by saying it feels nice to kind of be home. It feels like I'm returning home in some respects. I'm seeing these faces, people who have helped me along in my intellectual journey. And yet, at the same time, there's this poetic expression that I'm borrowing from you, Mir, which is, my words do not have a home. And I think there's this kind of interplay between your words and the home, or between the other being language, and subjectivity as such. That's the sort of area of questioning that I would like to go, which is somewhat psychoanalytical. And I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to approach it yet, but I have some sort of thoughts that are circulating, and I'm going to see if I can try and articulate them. One concerns this relationship that I see where you're bringing together two, maybe three domains, I would say. Badiou might call them truth conditions, I don't know. The idea is you have philosophy on the one hand, the exemplary case being Heidegger. On the other hand, you have poetry and psychoanalysis, which may or may not be related in certain particular ways, and that's a part of my question, perhaps, that I'll get to later. But of course, Freud, both publicly and in his private letters, and also Lacan, tended to characterize philosophy as system building, which they thought was not a good thing. The philosophers were keen on patching up holes in the universe. In other words, providing, as you put it in your overview on poetics, I think in your dissertation, which I just returned to now, provoking clarity and enlightenment, trying to eliminate darkness is how you put it. And that strikes me as somewhat antithetical to some of your characterizations of psychoanalysis, which would be a little bit different than providing clarity, right? So I guess my first question is about how you conceive of this relationship between philosophy and psychoanalysis in your dissertation, because I think that relationship, although it's not actively explored or interrogated, I think it gives rise to some other questions that I have regarding the sort of internal consistency of the dissertation, along with some other things. So if you can just speak a little bit to that, the relationship of philosophy to psychoanalysis and how those two are complementing one another or kind of critiquing one another in some way, that would be cool. Thanks.
Yeah, so I began my work with a philosophy that it recognizes and actually returns to poetry. So it is a philosophy that acknowledges that the philosophy is not a direct path to the truth. The statement that Plato was making. It is a distancing of in himself from the truth. It putting truth in layers and layers of semblance that cannot be reached. Instead, returning to the language of poetry and the poetry of language in order to have a direct relation with truth. So Heidegger is the key figure in my work, and also he's as Alan puts it, he's the first philosopher to take poetry serious and return to poetry and acknowledges that poetry is the way to truth. So with this, I don't see any sort of problem between poetry and philosophy. I dealt with a philosophy that is, in a sense, poetry.
Thank you so much. I would kind of further scrutinize it a little bit. You know, for example, the idea of what is a home. If we think of a home as a synonym for the other, in other words, the place of language. On the one hand, in the first part of your dissertation, what I notice is a working through of the logic of metaphor. Metaphor, what does metaphor say? Metaphor says, I am engaging as a subject that's missing within the system of language. So for example, Lacan would say a subject is represented by one signifier for another signifier as something that's missing. And so you have that example of the poem you were discussing earlier and so on. But the point of metaphor, which seems quite aligned with the early part of your dissertation, is that there is an other present and you're kind of missing from within the picture. But when I look, for example, at the later part of the dissertation, what I see is an engagement with the real unconscious, with Saint-Homme and with Lalanguge, which are inherently tools that are non-metaphorical. You know, for example, I posted, you might have saw on Facebook the other day, this quote from Jacques-Alain Miller. It says, what does poetry want to say? Poetry wants to say, when it is accomplished in the form of an analysis session, that I do not care about accuracy, the conformity of what I say with what others may believe, nor either with what can transmit to them. In other words, it says there is no other. When there is no other, what you have is Lalanguge, what you have is Saint-Homme to hold it all together, as you, I think, quite correctly suggest in the latter part of your dissertation. And it's the part I find very interesting, because when there's no other, there's no metaphor, as we know in the clinic with psychosis and schizophrenia and so on. So what you have instead is what some analysts, you may be aware of, discuss as a clinic of irony. When you have irony, you say, there is no other. I'm not engaging with it. I'm engaging with my own singular, that's a word I think you repeated in your dissertation, my own singular language, and I'm trying to establish some sort of or create another. So I'm wondering if you can speak more about how metaphor might have its place in the latter part of your dissertation with respect to Saint-Homme, with respect to Lalanguge and the real unconscious.
I think the idea of metaphor is very challenging. From one side, metaphor is what poetry is made of in general. You cannot, you could have a poem without metaphor, but it is very central to the idea of poetry. And from the other side, I definitely, follow what you just described, that what kind of problem metaphor could pose to the relationship between the real and its relationship with the symbolic. One of actually the areas that I would like to research more in my future studies and contemplation is to find or to eliminate this relation, to shed more light on this relation, the relationship of metaphor with the real unconscious, and with metaphor and poetry. What I can speak now is that metaphor could have a metaphorical presentation, not a very strict, clear function, that it could pose a threat to the relationship between the real and between the real and the real unconscious, and the symbolic. I'm sorry. So metaphor has the room to be interpreted metaphorically, and I take it to that point. So for now, metaphor functions metaphorically for me until I found a solution. I hope that is.
Yeah, because even a lot of the folks that are discussing, for example, the real unconscious today, and which is a relatively new thing, where they're zoning in, as you correctly put it, on the navel of the dream, this radical space of that fundamentally resists metaphorization. And there's an extent to which a lot of this sort of thinking has led to an analysis of the world where to some extent, or the culture at large, to some extent, we're seeing the sort of loss of metaphor, at least within the clinic. We don't hear people using metaphor quite as much. And of course, the whole grounding idea of the Oedipal complex was that it was an Oedipal metaphor, where you're exchanging the presence of the mother for the nom de père, for the fundamental signifier, and therefore effacing the mother's desire and replacing it with language. Right, that was what Lacan described in his On a Question Prior to Any Preliminary Treatment of Psychosis. He literally creates a formula for metaphor, and he describes it as the foundation of neurosis. And of course, today we're talking about a sort of post-Oedipal world where that grounding metaphor has kind of collapsed. And so what people like, for example, some of the people you're citing in your dissertation, Jacques-Alain Miller, Colette Solaire, and others, what they're discussing, and even Lacan, the late Lacan, is after the collapse of metaphor, there's some sort of what they refer to as a compensatory make-believe function that takes the place of metaphor, that allows people to establish a link with the other that didn't hitherto exist. And of course, there's all kinds of ways to do that through artistic practice and perhaps poetry. So that's kind of just where I'm going. Again, it's kind of an unclear thought right now, but
I could add, doing that metaphor by providing the possibility of more interpretation, sort of makes a delusion of the void and the gap that produces the real. That is the root of the problem. So we do not want to have that spacing of the space, or sort of covering up of the gap that we have. So metaphor provides a extension for the language, showing the language's function. There's no gap, there's no navel. And so I see that as a absolutely fundamental problem. But this is a kind of area that is not a full extended everlasting of the covering of the void. There is a void, and the void can be uncovered through a proper reading of a poem, to a proper reading of a metaphor. And that is I mentioned previously that metaphor functions metaphorically. And if we read it properly, there is a way into it to discover the gap and the hole in language.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on, if we could have the questions from Professor Donaldson.
Thank you. Well, Mira, I can't let my turn go by without first thanking you for coming to Canada and being you. And when I think of when we first met in the late aughts, and the journey that you'd already been through, and the struggles, and the strength of character and intelligence that made it possible for you to carve a space for yourself inside Canadian academia at a time when you were still figuring out the language, and it was extraordinary to me. And getting through the MA, and now this celebration, and the fact that your work and achievement is the occasion of this gathering, this community. This community is an expression of your spirit, and I just feel nothing but thanks for that. I've got just three. I think they're probably just whimsical questions, but kind of picking up on the spirit of a metaphor that Ross started us off with. And actually, no, two. One thing I just want to quibble about, and it won't take us long. It occurs on page 256. You don't need to turn there because it's a conceptual issue. Poetry and its relation to meaning. And the sentence that you begin with is, meaning is the main purpose and foundation of communication. Meaning is the main purpose and foundation of communication. And I just wonder, you know, my feelings about talking about poems in terms of meanings. Generally, I think of them as more as experiences. As I think of the whole notion of a meaning as a relatively constraining, particularly in relation to ontology, like the being of the poem. But isn't it the other way around, or couldn't one argue that it's the other way around, that communication is the basis of meaning, not meaning is the basis of communication? Because communication covers such a broader range of possibilities, right? I wish to communicate. What do I wish to communicate? Not as, maybe it is a meaning, maybe it's something else that belongs to the poem or poetic experience. But did you want to account for why you felt meaning is the basis of communication rather than the other way around?
Okay, so before I go to this question, I would acknowledge that without you, I wouldn't be able to stand here. Thank you. You were a friend, a good friend, you know, a teacher. You know, you come all the way from where I just began speaking English. Okay.
It's been a great trip.
Okay. So, by communication, I sort of have a reduction attempt, an approach that I see communication as, you know, communicating with one another.
Yes.
Sort of transporting meaning between one another. In this sense, transporting meaning, saying something that to others, that, you know, to sort of transport their intention. That's how I approach. I really see your point, and it's very interesting to go from that point, and perhaps in that occasion we take communication in a very bigger scale. But my approach was absolutely the communication.
Yeah, I can see that it simply requires that there be a more refined definition of what you mean by communication. Not, you know, not the speech act in its broadest conception, along with all the purposes and intentions that can be implied in a speech act, but something more constrained, that the getting across of meaning would put meaning first, and I can understand it in those terms. Okay, here are the two more whimsical, slightly playful in metaphoric terms, but I'm curious what you think of these. I really loved that part of your thesis where you were talking about, it was the Freudian section, and you were talking about the how reading a poem is like a scene of analysis, is like the talk cure, where you get closer to the reader is the analyst, the poem is the analysand, and there is a kind of talk cure that of unfolding from the poem's unconscious into the reader's or the analyst's larger and larger understanding. So my question is the poem sick?
Well, it depends how you define sickness.
Yeah.
If you define it as something or someone has lost relation, yes, the poem is sick, and
Yes.
we need to rebuild those relations. So the purpose of taking poem to analysis session is to rebuild or reintroduce or discover the lost relation, the ones this poem had. And so perhaps this relation is sort of could range very in a singular way, but it is the main problem or the main sickness is the lost relation.
Yeah, yeah, very, very good. And I imagine when I first thought of the implication of that connection, and I was resisting the idea. Oh, the poem's not sick. Why would we think of poems as sick? But yeah, when we think of where you're headed with this notion of a larger unfolding into the consciousness of the reader or analyst, then the poem does begin at a kind of bottom level, at in a kind of state of unrealization, of unsurfacing, and that can be seen as a lack from an original point of view. And then there would be the different reading experiences depending on the skill of an analyst, where the poem is left not much better off than it was in the first place, because the attention to it has been poor at whatever level. My last question and my other sort of whimsical extension of a metaphor that you're already working with to see where it goes is has to do with this idea of the poem's navel. The fascinating idea that there is that core of the inexplicable, the ineffable that lies within the poem. And so I'm wondering how far to go there, because we know what navels are. And I'm wondering if one of the implications of this uncapturable core of the poem, does it suggest that there is an umbilicus? Does it suggest that there was an earlier belonging in the poem that may account for its being a navel? Like, why that particular metaphor of navel? Because we know navels are the trace of an earlier belonging and being attached to something other than what it is. And I'm wondering if that's an intention of that metaphor in our conception of the poem as having a navel, that it has that, you're reading this poem and you're finding you're mystified by a certain thing, and you realize, oh, that's the point where the inexplicable poem actually belongs to something that I don't see, that I don't know.
Okay, so very, very interesting question. I quoted Freud counting 4 characteristics of qualification of dream. One of them were they're scattered and mobile. They're not fixated in a specific place.
Yes.
In my understanding, especially in poetry, the navel of the poem is scattered, is mobile. It's not something fixated to any specific metaphor. It's caused by the relation of metaphor to each other, by the relation of words to each other and images. Yeah. And also it varies from one reader to another reader, from one reading to another reading. It depends how you approach. There is an intrinsic blockage in your reading, and this blockage is mobile. It's scattered.
Yeah.
In different readings, it could move from one image, one metaphor to the next metaphor, and and present a new blockage. So imagine if we had a discoverable and sort of poetry navel, and we could see, hey, this is the the problem maker. We could take that away.
Yeah.
But the poetic part of the issue is that this point is keep moving in each reading. It differs.
Yeah. 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 Good. No, that's fine. my first impression of it is that it's as a metaphor for, as you're calling it, the mobile and slippery bubble of absence or inexplicability that moves around inside a poem, that the metaphor of the navel doesn't quite get at it somehow, or it leaves parts out. And there are the implications of that there, that I like, that the poem is a body, that it is the source, that point in the poem or points in the poem is a source of a former nourishment. Right? You can play around with those ideas, but from what I understand of how we're thinking of the poem in these terms, we're not really exercising the naval metaphor that far, right? We're simply using it as a metaphor for the core thing.
Well, in terms of terminology, I don't think naval could explain that the void we have in poetry.
Yes.
And perhaps in my understanding this is not a certain or a specific metaphor that causes this navel. It is coming from the relationship between metaphors and
very good.
Words. Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's me.
All right, thank you. And finally, we have Professor Hodges.
Hey, Mir. Congratulations on navigating this dissertation with a supervisor who was so manifestly unable to help you with the really difficult stuff, and who was consistently skeptical about the tack you were taking. I'm very impressed that you got this ship to harbor. I want to talk a little bit, perhaps in a really pedestrian sort of way, about a couple of lines of poetry. This kind of follows up on what Jeffrey was saying about navels. One of the things I've been skeptical about throughout is the way I feel what you're doing anthropomorphizes poetry, right? We've argued a bit about this, that you talk about poetry desiring things, poetry wanting things, poetry having an unconscious, and poetry having a navel, which is about as anthropomorphic a metaphor as you can come up with, right? The poem I want to talk about is Fishing on the Susquehanna, and I particularly want to talk about that egg of time. I say that the navel is anthropomorphic because, apart from anything else, chickens don't have navels, right? so I mean, it's not just a biological metaphor, that the navel, it's a specifically human metaphor. But I think I'm going to read the poem. It's short enough that it's useful to have it in our heads when we talk about that little egg of time. And I really do want to ask you to say a bit more about the egg of time, the little egg of time. As Ross says, in this draft, your explanations, your discussion of the poems is far more fulsome than it was in the first draft, which I really appreciate. But I still wanted to say more about the little egg of time, particularly in this poem, which is a poem cluttered, jammed with really what we would call concrete images, right? If as you say, poems think in images, the images this poem tends to think in, or almost exclusively thinks in, are really concrete sensory images, until we get to that little egg of time, which is suddenly this strangely abstract, unreal image in the middle of the poem. Very quickly, the poem. I have never been fishing on the Susquehanna, or on any river for that matter, to be perfectly honest. Not in July or any month have I had the pleasure, if it is a pleasure, of fishing on the Susquehanna. I am more likely to be found in a quiet room like this one, a painting of a woman on the wall, a bowl of tangerines on the table, trying to manufacture the sensation of fishing on the Susquehanna. There's little doubt that others have been fishing on the Susquehanna, rowing upstream in a wooden boat, sliding the oars under the water, then raising them to drip in the light. But the nearest I have ever come to fishing on the Susquehanna was one afternoon in a museum in Philadelphia, when I balanced a little egg of time in front of a painting in which that river curled around a bend under a blue, cloud-ruffled sky, dense trees along the banks, and a fellow with a red bandana sitting in a small, green, flat-bottomed boat holding the thin whip of a pole. That is something I am unlikely ever to do, I remember saying to myself and the person next to me. Then I blinked and moved on to other American scenes of haystacks, water whitening over rocks, even one of a brown hare who seemed so wired with alertness, I imagined him springing right out of the frame. So about this, what you say is, the speaker talks about balancing a little egg of time in front of a painting. In Heideggerian terms, this is projective saying. Now, projective saying you have defined as the saying of secret content, the letting go of language, unconcealment, coming into being, right? So you say that this little egg of time is an example of Heidegger's projective saying, showing what we want to say. Then you say the speaker may intend to say that the idea of fishing on the Susquehanna has become a very central issue in his life, or that he has rearranged his daily sensations with the sensation of fishing on the Susquehanna. We may also say that balancing the egg of time in front of a painting could mean that the speaker wanted to say that the painting is everlasting, or that he would want it to be so. So I have two questions that I'd like you to riff on, perhaps. One is, if this is projective saying, if this is a moment of unconcealment, of coming into being, of revealing secret content, why do you still have to speculate? Right? If this is a moment when the poem says what it wants to say and unconceals itself, why do you still have to speculate about what the speaker may intend? That's one question. Okay. The other question is, why a little egg of time? Sorry?
Can we go one by one? I don't want to miss it.
Well, let me give you both questions, because they do connect. So, but yeah, the second question when we come to it is, why that image? If poems speak in images, if poems reveal themselves in images, if they speak projectively in images, why that image? Why a little egg of time rather than some other image that might also suggest that he thinks of the Susquehanna as being central in his life, right? So, okay, so those are the questions. But yes, that first question, why do we still have to speculate? And why that image?
Okay, before I begin, I think I was so lucky to have a supervisor who were accessible all the time. And you actually helped me so much in philosophical difficulties that I have there, making sense of the difficult ideas. And I am really thankful to have you and have you on my side. Thank you. And I always remember you with respect and love. So I think if someone asked me what is metaphor, I would read this poem, and every part is a metaphor itself. The desire to expressing the desire to fish in somewhere is expressed in a way that either the fishing has been done, it's not very clear that he really hadn't been there, or we may think that like this metaphor as this is that and this is not that. So so each part of this poem function as a metaphor as a whole. And in direct to your first question, why do we speculate if this is a way of unconcealing the truth? The answer is that there is no definitive and specific and pre-made truth. Truth is made through the speculation of language. So as you speculate, you not only sort of determine, but you create your own truth of this poem. So if we believe the truth as something outside of this phenomena, and you know, some as Heidegger puts it, if you think the truth is somewhere in the sky, we don't see truth as that thing. In Heideggerian term, truth is on concealment, and concealment comes from your engagement, your speculation, and this is your truth, and that could be not my truth.
Is it the or the poem's truth?
Sorry? The poem's
okay.
truth, yeah. The poem's truth, yeah. So let's say if you want to find out if he has actually gone to that river to fish, and as we can see that he hasn't gone, and then he was in a museum, right? But anyway, if you make any relation and find the truth of this poem, this is a specific poem for you, you need to contemplate, you need to speculate in order to find it. Should I move on, or
Yep.
the second question?
Yeah, do, yes.
Okay. The second question, I guess, is a bit challenging and more difficult question. That why this image? Why not something else? I think to deal with this question, we need to come from two different angles. One is sort of a literary angle, a poetic as a technique, a poetic technique, and how poetry functions. And the other angle is sort of a psychological approach. So from the first angle, I think each poet chooses his own words and makes or creates his own images and makes the relation between those words and images possible and accessible to his readers or to her readers. In this case, I could not ask why he's putting that image in front of me, why he's not speaking or bringing up another type of images to build another relationship. What I could question is the type of relation that a specific image makes with other images, and the way that image functions in that environment. So in sort of in a poetic approach, it is absolutely up to the poet, and I am dealing with a fixed entity or phenomenon, fixed material, if you will call it. I know poetry is not a fixed work. It's a progress, an ongoing project. But when it comes to its materiality, its wording, it's fixed. I cannot change the wording of this poem at all, and this is what it is. So it has been chosen by the poet, and he preferred this image to different images. But what it comes to me is the way it functions and relates to other images.
Sorry, say that again.
What it comes to me as a reader is the functionality and relation of each images to each other.
All right. Can you say a bit more about what that relation is?
So the relation, for example, the relation of the egg of time, right? So this image creates a very strong and transformative connection and relation with other words. Let's say if you take this image out and put something out instead, you will absolutely feel the missing of something there, because the way this image speaks, it speaks ontologically to other images. It's not speaking in a poetic function alone. It is a ontological relation between this specific image and other images. So what I care and what I have to deal with is the type of relation of each word making with other words and the way each image functions. So those are the important things for me.
Okay. I have to press though, Mir. Why? Okay, I agree. Any other word would be different. It would fill the space differently. What would be missing is the word egg, and another word would be in there. I just desperately want you to say something about eggs, specifically about what the image of an egg does in this poem. And because as you know, I've been skeptical about the way in which I've been skeptical about your assertion that positing an unconscious of the poem gives us a way to interpret poems, that there's no practical, I've always been suspicious that there's no practical application for what you're talking about. There's basically a theological argument. But here it seems to me that you've got a perfect opportunity to point to with the word egg as a moment where that word particularly resonates with some of the things you're trying to demonstrate.
So this could be a proof of my idea of poetic navel, that probably I could not relate or discover those relations properly as you have done it. But what I could see is that the egg of time is absolutely the coming into being of time, or sort of not just opportunity, because opportunity is something given, but the egg of time is something coming to being from nothing, from out of being in Heideggerian terms.
Without a navel.
Yes. That was the navel.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mir. I won't torment you anymore with eggs.
Thank you.
Back to you, Kelly.
Yeah, so with that, I actually am going to ask the committee if we should go through another round.
I'm
either way.
I myself am quite satisfied with the with the conversation and the demonstration of Mir's expertise in the field. Like, one could always come up with more questions, but I could very easily pass my own turn.
It's just the questions and answers have been so provocative that I'd like to continue for hours, but I don't think we'll have that chance. I mean, I'd love to talk about the reification of Hölderlin in relation to the Nazis, or the collapse of the Oedipal metaphor, and therefore what is metaphor doing now, or even Collins' poem and repetition, and Heidegger's notion of repetition as opposed to the egg, which is not repeating, and so on. It's so many fascinating questions that come up out of this, but yeah, I'm satisfied.
My next round of questions, we're going to move on from torturing Mir with fish eggs to moving on to camels and what are the other animals you focus on? You gravitate towards poems with animals in them, Mir. Frogs, that's the other one. But yeah, no, I'm happy to ask Mir those questions at some other time. They're not make or break questions exactly.
Dwayne, Ihor, how are you feeling?
As was mentioned, there's plenty that we could talk about, but I mean, I'm satisfied to open this up to audience questions and to pass on the further issues that I had noted down. It's fine by me.
Well, for the sake of time, I would like to limit the audience questions, but if there are audience questions, this would be the time to ask them. And if you do have a question, if you could turn on your mic and your video. As we all wait in anticipation, the eggs of time among us. Jonathan
is speaking but doesn't have his mic on. There we go.
Yeah, so I want to just go back really to the beginning. when Mir came to visit us. And, we put Mir through a whole test, really. He came and visited us. Jeffrey came and visited us. We really had to think about, Mir coming in, and the defining moment really about his entering into the program, is so beautifully expressed actually by Jeffrey. And that is, and my own sense of, however I was dealing with background and formation and, Afghanistan, Iran, Canada, practice of language, all of those sorts of considerations. There were two things that were really guiding in terms of my feeling at the time. Really, I must say, rolling the dice. That that Mir really should be given a shot here, and this is the kind of PhD program that should allow this possibility. And the first thing really was, perhaps it's my own attachment to poetry, and the way that when one comes to be an academic, and in particular when it comes to practice bizarre art of theory, that in fact, which is itself a kind of poetics, that in fact it comes to transform what, let's call it, a poetic impulse is. And Mir, in his conviction with respect to what he wanted to write about, the source from which he wanted to in fact write that, the primary, even primitive questions he would ask for people who come from, say, my training, was compelling, really, on the one hand. And at the same time, there just was this utter conviction that he was going to do this against, really, in terms of all the burdens he was carrying and everything else. I mean, at the time when he was in this program, he was commuting back and forth, if you can believe it, from Montreal. I mean, it just made, the whole thing was just incredible. And there, at the same time, there was a persistence and a sense that he was going to, in fact, do this. And so that kind of compulsion just was something that, from my point of view, was not stoppable. And at the same time, so to come some years later to get a message from Mir that he's just about finished, I just can't tell you how happy I was, and that's why I feel that, and I'm also really happy that he came to have Hugh as a supervisor, because Hugh has an attitude to things where well, how do I put it? He embraces what you think, but he always has reserve about what he thinks at the same time. And so he's always forcing you to keep saying more and more and more about it. And so I felt that, the choice of Hugh to be the director, that Hugh took it on supervisor, was just really, really fortuitous choice. So looking at the way the whole thing has unfolded, I'm just honestly just very, very happy about everything. And I've had a chance to, I can't say thoroughly read the PhD, but in fact, he cast that kind of glance one casts when involved in academic reading. And I just really was really delighted at the depth of the thesis, the attention to details, cases, and that he was for better or for worse, a good student in cultural studies and theory. He picked 4 theorists essentially, and he related all his work to those theorists in a really, really tenacious way, without giving up the poetic insights he had on the one side, and his reference to other poets, in fact, including his mentor and friend Jeffrey, who give their work and their attention to literary aesthetics, poetic aesthetics attention. And so it's just the whole thing, just a coup de foudre for me. And I'm just really so pleased to have been invited to come. I really thank you for telling me. Mir, it wouldn't necessarily be obvious in cultural studies these days for me to be brought in, but I really appreciate your telling me, and I'm really so glad to actually attend this defense.
Thank you so much for taking the time and joining our program. And I really appreciate the works, the amount of works you have done, and the time you spend to help me to provide me with opportunities. Thank you so much, and I will always remember you with love and respect.
If there are no other questions, I'm going to ask if the audience would move into the breakout room. And as the audience is doing that, I'm going to pause the recording. So the slow return is happening here.
30 seconds.
They all just wait to be dragged over rather than making it happen. Can I be the first to say congratulations, Dr. Mahdavi.
Likewise, congratulations, Dr. Mahdavi. Well done.
Bravo, Mir. Congratulations.
Yeah, I should just say on behalf of the committee that they've decided that your dissertation is approved as is, with some minor cosmetic revisions, which Hugh will be contacting you about that as we move forward. And yes, congratulations is in order from everyone to everyone.
Mir, you've got your microphone off there. Just in case you had any questions.
I think Mir was going to read us a poem, weren't you, Mir?
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to say thank you to all of you. Without you, I couldn't be sitting here. I really appreciate it. You don't know how much you all mean to me. Thank you.
Are you going to read a poem?
Sure, it's a Farsi poem.
Great.
Yeah.
Is that okay, a Farsi poem?
Absolutely.
Okay. It's Ghazal by the king of Farsi's Ghazal, Hafiz. دوش رفتم به در میکده خواب آلوده خرقت در دامن و سجاده شراب آلوده آمد افسوس کنان مغبچه باده فروش گفت بیدار شوی رهرو خواب آلوده شستشویی کن آنگه به خرابات خرام تا نگردد ز تو این دیر خراب آلوده به هوای لب شیرین دهنان چند کنی جوهر روح به یاقوت مذاب آلوده به طهارت گذران منزل پیری و مکن خلعت شیب چو تشویش شباب آلوده پاک و صافی شو از چاه طبیعت به درآ که صفایی ندهد آب گلاب آلوده آب تراب آلوده گفتم ای جان جهان دفتر گل عیبی نیست گر شود که شود فصل بهار از می ناب آلوده آشنایان ره عشق در این بحر عمیق غرقه گشتند و نگشتن به آب آلوده گفت حافظ لغز و نکته به یاران نفروش آه از این لطف به انواع عتاب آلوده. Thank you.
Beautiful. Mir, what does the refrain line mean?
It's very common in Farsi ghazals to have that corner lines that repeating all the time, and it's very metaphorical, like the source of metaphor for the whole. And as Dr. Lucky was mentioning, the repetition of this metaphor, but in a very metaphorical way. It doesn't mean fixated. It doesn't contain fixated meaning as you may see it. It is offering you sort of attachment metaphor, and every part, time is repeated. It different meaning. Different meaning. Yeah.
Yes. Beautifully read.
Thank you.
All right, Mir, I will be in touch by email. And looks like we've got a week to polish up a couple of typos and things.
Okay.
So we'll get on with that. Or
Okay,
sorry, you'll get on with that.
And if you could send me the recorded video as well too, please.
Of course.
Thank you.
Nice to see everyone again. Ross, I'll be in touch shortly, soon. And Mir, let's be in touch too.
Sure. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks for participating in this, and congratulations once again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.